The Dungeon Lord Book 1, The First Incarnation, Chapter 1, The Waking Stone. Tim Willett opened his eyes to green, not the green of a bedroom ceiling or the pale green of hospital walls, but the deep, living green of a forest canopy filtering morning sunlight into golden threads. He lay on his back in moss and fallen leaves, his body unmarked, his clothes simple travel wear, leather and wool foreign to him yet somehow his. He sat up slowly, testing limbs that responded with perfect coordination. No stiffness, no pain. He rolled his shoulders, flexed his fingers, touched his face. Young, maybe 25 years old if he had to guess. His hands were calloused in ways that suggested sword work, though he had never held a sword in his life. Except he had. The memory surfaced like a stone rising through water. A blade in his hand, a cavern lit by strange phosphorescent moss, a creature lunging at him with too many limbs. He had struck once, precisely, and the creature had collapsed mid-leap, dead before it hit the ground. Tim pressed his palms against his temples. The memories were there, crisp and clear, but they belonged to someone else. Or rather, they belonged to him, but from a life he had never lived. No, that wasn't right, either. He had lived it, he simply didn't remember living it until now. First Incarnation, he said aloud, his voice unfamiliar in his own ears. Deeper than he expected, steadier. The words felt true the moment he spoke them. This was his first life. The memories flooding his mind were not from a previous existence, but from something else entirely. Knowledge, granted at birth, woven into his very being like instinct. He knew things no newborn should know. He understood systems that did not yet have names. He could feel, deep in his bones, that this world had recently changed. Dungeons. The word crystallized in his thoughts with perfect clarity. Dungeons had appeared in this world for the first time. Structures that violated natural law, spaces larger inside than outside, filled with creatures that should not exist and treasures that defied origin. The gods had made them. And in making them, they had made a mistake. They had made him. Tim stood, testing his balance. He felt strong, unnaturally so. He looked down at his hands again, turning them over. No scars, no blemishes. He would not age, he knew. Not meaningfully. Not for 900 years, give or take. And when his body finally wore down, when time or violence or simple exhaustion claimed him, he would wake again. Somewhere else. Someone else. With every memory intact. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it settled over him like a coat tailored to fit. He was Tim Willett. He was 25 years old. He was also something far older than this body, older than this world in some fundamental way. He was a flaw in the divine machinery, a crack in the foundation of creation. And he was alone in a forest with no idea where he was. Tim walked. The forest had no paths, but his feet found purchase easily enough. He moved with unconscious grace, avoiding roots and low branches, as though he had walked these woods 1,000 times. Perhaps some part of him had. The knowledge in his head extended beyond dungeons. He knew how to track game, how to identify edible plants, how to read the angle of sunlight through trees to determine direction. South. He was walking south. Toward what? He didn't know, but south felt correct. After 2 hours, he heard voices. Tim slowed, moving quietly through the underbrush until he could see the source. A road, narrow and rutted, cutting through the forest. A caravan of 4 wagons rolled along it, pulled by heavy draft horses. Guards walked alongside, armed with spears and short swords, their eyes scanning the tree line with nervous vigilance. Tim hesitated. He had money. He checked his pockets and found a small leather purse with coins he somehow knew were silver. He had weapons, a long knife at his belt, well-balanced and sharp. He had clothes that would not draw undue attention. Everything he needed to enter civilization had been provided, as though the universe itself had prepared for his arrival. But he had no history, no story, no answer to the question, "Where are you from?" He stepped out of the forest anyway. The nearest guard spotted him immediately and shouted, leveling his spear. The caravan lurched to a halt. 3 more guards converged, surrounding Tim with weapons raised. "Easy," Tim said, raising his hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Where did you come from?" the lead guard demanded. He was older, grizzled, with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheek. "The forest," Tim said truthfully. "Alone?" "Yes." The guards exchanged glances. The scarred one narrowed his eyes. "Bandits work these woods. You one of them?" "No." Then what are you doing out here alone? Tim considered lying, considered fabricating a story about being separated from his own caravan, about fleeing bandits or wild animals. But the truth was simpler, and he suspected these men would smell a lie. I woke up in the forest this morning, he said. I don't know how I got there. The guards didn't lower their weapons, but their stances shifted slightly. Confusion replacing suspicion. You don't remember? The scarred guard asked. I remember who I am, Tim said. Tim Willett. But I don't remember how I ended up in the forest. I was hoping to reach a town, find work, figure things out. It wasn't quite a lie. He was Tim Willett, and he was trying to figure things out, even if the mystery he was solving had nothing to do with amnesia. The scarred guard studied him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. You don't look like a drunk or a lunatic, and you're armed but not aggressive. He glanced at the other guards. Search him. Tim allowed it. They found his knife, his coin purse, and nothing else. No stolen goods, no bandit tokens. Just a young man with silver in his pocket and no explanation for his presence. There's a town half a day's walk south, the scarred guard said finally. Crahan. You can find work there, if you're willing. Probably find answers too, if you ask the right people. He jerked his head toward the road. Walk with us if you want, safer than traveling alone. Thank you, Tim said. The guard grunted and waved the caravan forward. Tim fell into step beside the rearmost wagon, and the guards kept a wary eye on him but made no further challenges. Crahan appeared as the sun reached its zenith. It was not a large town. Perhaps 2,000 people, clustered around a central square with a stone well and a wooden platform that might have served as a stage or a gallows depending on the day. Buildings leaned against each other like old friends, their walls a patchwork of wood, stone, and plaster. Smoke rose from chimneys, the smell of baking bread mixed with horse dung and tanning leather. Tim thanked the caravan guards and made his way toward the square. People moved around him with purpose, carrying baskets and tools, haggling at market stalls, shouting greetings to neighbors. No one paid him special attention. He was just another traveler in a world full of them. Except he wasn't. He could feel it as he walked, a pull, faint but insistent, tugging at his awareness like a thread hooked beneath his ribs. He turned his head, following the sensation, and his eyes landed on a building at the edge of the square. It was newer than the others, constructed from clean timber, and painted with symbols Tim recognized instantly. A spiral descending into darkness, a sword crossed with a staff, a chest overflowing with gold. Adventurers Guild. The words appeared in his mind unbidden, along with a flood of associated knowledge. Dungeons had been discovered only months ago. The first one had appeared in a mountain range 200 miles north, and within weeks, others had manifested across the known world. The Adventurers Guild had formed in response, an organization dedicated to exploring these phenomena, retrieving treasures, and preventing dungeon-spawned monsters from spilling into the outside world. To enter a dungeon legally, one needed to register as an adventurer. Tim walked toward the building. Inside, the guild hall was organized chaos. A long wooden counter dominated the far wall, staffed by 3 clerks frantically sorting papers and arguing with adventurers about requisition forms and monster bounties. Tables filled the main room, occupied by men and women in mismatched armor, cleaning weapons, studying maps, or drinking despite the early hour. A board on the left wall was covered in notices, dungeon sightings, requests for specific materials, warnings about dangerous floors. Tim approached the counter. The nearest clerk, a middle-aged woman with ink-stained fingers and an expression of permanent exhaustion, glanced up at him. "Registration or requisition?" she asked. "Registration," Tim said. She sighed and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Name?" "Tim Willett." She wrote it down. "Experience?" "None." She looked up, eyebrow raised. "You've never been in a dungeon?" "No." "Then why are you registering?" Tim met her gaze. "Because I want to go into one." The clerk stared at him for a moment, then shook her head and returned to her paperwork. "Age? 25? Weapon proficiency?" Tim hesitated. He knew instinctively that he could use a blade, but he had no formal training, no documented experience. "Knife work," he said finally. "Some sword training." "Magic?" "No." She made a note. "You'll be registered as a Tier 1 adventurer. That means you're only cleared for minor dungeons, the ones marked with a single spiral. You go into anything higher, and the guild won't cover your funeral. Understand? I understand. Registration fee is 5 silver. Tim counted out the coins. The clerk took them, stamped a metal plate with his name, and handed it to him along with a leather cord. Wear that around your neck whenever you're in a dungeon, she said. If you die, it helps us identify the body. Welcome to the guild. Tim left the guild hall with the identification plate hanging from his neck and a strange sense of purpose settling over him. He had money for lodging, enough for a few days at least. He had a legal right to enter dungeons, and he had knowledge, vast, intricate, and entirely internal, about systems that no one else in this world yet understood. He walked through Crahan, observing. Adventurers gathered in groups, comparing notes about dungeon floors, arguing about trap placements, speculating about boss monster weaknesses. They were children playing at a game whose rules they did not know, stumbling through trial and error, losing friends and colleagues to mistakes that could have been avoided. Tim could see the pattern already. They did not understand that dungeons were alive. They treated them as static puzzles, failing to recognize that every trap adjusted, every monster adapted, every floor learned from the adventurers who entered it. But he knew. And soon, the dungeons would know him too. He found an inn called the Split Coin, rented a room for 3 nights, and lay down on a bed that smelled faintly of lavender and old sweat. Through the window, he could see the edge of the forest where he had woken that morning. Somewhere beyond Cran, perhaps a day's travel east, there was a dungeon. He could feel it the same way he had felt the guild hall. A pull, faint but undeniable. Tomorrow, he would find it. Tomorrow, the dungeon lord would enter his first dungeon, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 2. The First Descent. Tim woke before dawn, dressed in the same clothes he'd arrived in, and strapped his knife to his belt. The inn was quiet, except for the creak of floorboards and the distant clatter of pots from the kitchen below. He descended the stairs, nodded to the innkeeper, who was stoking the fire, and stepped out into the pre-dawn chill of Crahan's streets. The pull was stronger this morning. He'd felt it all night, even in sleep, a gentle but insistent tug eastward, like a hook beneath his sternum, drawing him toward something inevitable. He followed it through empty streets, past shuttered shops and sleeping houses, until the buildings gave way to farmland, and the farmland gave way to forest. An hour's walk brought him to a clearing. The dungeon entrance stood in the center like a wound in the world. It was a stone archway, 10 feet tall and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They shifted when he tried to focus on them, spiraling and reforming in patterns that suggested meaning without ever quite resolving into language. Beyond the arch was darkness, not the darkness of a cave or a cellar, but something deeper, more absolute. A darkness that pulled. Tim stopped at the clearing's edge, studying the entrance. Around it, the grass had died in a perfect circle, 20 feet in diameter. The trees leaned away as though repelled. The air tasted metallic. He took a step forward. I wouldn't go in there alone if I were you. Tim spun, hand dropping to his knife. A young woman stood at the tree line, arms crossed, watching him with an expression caught between amusement and concern. She was his age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and leather armor that had seen genuine use. A short sword hung at her hip, and a small pack rested at her feet. Sorry, she said, raising her hands in a placating gesture. Didn't mean to startle you, just thought you should know that going into a dungeon solo is a really bad idea. Tim relaxed slightly but didn't remove his hand from the knife. You've been in one before? A few times. Minor dungeons, nothing crazy. She tilted her head, studying him. You haven't though, have you? Is it that obvious? You're staring at the entrance like it's going to explain itself. She stepped closer, her boots crunching on dead grass. Sarah G. Well, Sarah Gellin, but everyone calls me Sarah G because there are 3 Sarahs in the guild, and it gets confusing. Tim Willett. Nice to meet you, Tim Willett. She glanced at the dungeon entrance, then back at him. Look, I don't know you and you don't know me, but I'm guessing you registered yesterday, right? First timer wanting to see what all the fuss is about? Tim nodded slowly. Okay, so here's the thing. Dungeons are weird. They don't follow normal rules. Traps that look safe will kill you. Monsters that look weak will tear you apart. And if you die in there alone, nobody's gonna find your body until it's too late to matter. She paused. But if you go in with a party, even a small one, your odds improve dramatically. You're offering to party with me? I'm offering to not let you get yourself killed on your first run. Yes. Sarah G grinned. My friend and I have been running this dungeon for a week now, mapping the first floor, learning the patterns. We're short one person for a proper 3-person team. You'd be doing us a favor as much as we'd be doing you one. Tim considered. He didn't need a party. He knew that on some fundamental level. The moment he stepped through that archway, he would understand the dungeon in ways Sarah G and her friend never could. But he also knew that traveling alone would draw attention. It would raise questions. And questions led to scrutiny he didn't want. Besides, Sarah G seemed decent, straightforward, the kind of person who would warn a stranger about danger instead of letting them walk into it. All right, Tim said. I'll party with you. Sarah G's grin widened. Excellent. Tony's going to be thrilled. Well, not thrilled exactly. Tony doesn't really do thrilled, but he'll approve. She shouldered her pack and gestured toward the northern edge of the clearing. He's waiting at our camp. We were planning to go in this morning anyway, so your timing's perfect. The camp was a small affair. A single tent, a cold fire pit, and a young man sitting on a fallen log, methodically sharpening a sword. He looked up as they approached, and Tim's first thought was that this man did not belong here. It wasn't anything obvious. His clothes were practical. Leather trousers, a linen shirt, a vest reinforced with metal studs. His sword was well made, but not ostentatious. His boots were broken in and mud-stained. Everything about him screamed adventurer. But he sat too straight. His movements, even the simple act of running a whetstone along a blade, were too precise, too controlled. When he stood to greet them, he rose in a single fluid motion, weight perfectly balanced, as though he'd been taught by someone who cared deeply about posture and presentation. Tony, Sarah G said. This is Tim Willett. He's new to the guild. I invited him to join our party for the dungeon run. Tony studied Tim with pale gray eyes that were sharp and measuring. He was tall, taller than Tim by a few inches, with blonde hair cut shorter than was fashionable among the other adventurers Tim had seen. His features were even, almost delicate, and his hands, despite the calluses from sword work, were clean in a way that suggested he washed them often. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Tim, Tony said, extending his hand. The words were correct. Polite, but they were delivered with the kind of careful enunciation that made Tim wonder if Tony had practiced saying them in front of a mirror. Tim shook his hand. Tony's grip was firm, but not aggressive, and he released it at exactly the socially appropriate moment. Sarah mentioned you've been mapping the first floor, Tim said. We have. Tony returned to his log and resumed sharpening his sword. The dungeon's layout appears consistent across multiple entries. We've documented 17 traps, 9 monster spawn points, and 3 treasure chests. The boss chamber is at the northern terminus, accessible via a main corridor or 2 secondary routes. The way he spoke, measured, formal, as though delivering a report, made Tim's instincts prickle. This wasn't how common adventurers talked. This was how someone who had been educated talked. Someone who had been taught to present information clearly and concisely to people who expected clarity and conciseness. Someone who had been trained for leadership. Sounds like you've been thorough, Tim said carefully. Thoroughness prevents unnecessary casualties, Tony replied without looking up from his blade. Sarah G rolled her eyes. What Tony means is that we're careful. Maybe too careful. We've been in and out of the first floor 6 times now, and we still haven't fought the boss because Tony insists on understanding every single trap mechanism before we proceed. Understanding the mechanisms ensures we can avoid them, Tony said, his tone patient but firm. Rushing leads to mistakes. Rushing also leads to actually finishing a dungeon run. Tony set down his whetstone and met Sarah G's gaze. Would you prefer to finish quickly or finish alive? Sarah G sighed. Alive, obviously. Then we proceed carefully. The exchange had the cadence of an old argument, worn smooth by repetition. Tim watched them, noting the way Sarah G deferred to Tony's judgment, despite her frustration, the way Tony's expression softened slightly when he looked at her, as though reassuring a younger sibling. Whatever Tony was hiding, Sarah G either didn't see it or didn't care. "So," Sarah G said, turning to Tim, "you ready to see your first dungeon?" Tim glanced at the archway visible through the trees. The pull was still there, stronger now, almost eager. "I'm ready," he said. The moment Tim stepped through the archway, the world inverted. It wasn't a physical sensation. His body didn't change, the ground didn't shift, but something in his mind clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. The darkness beyond the arch resolved into a stone corridor lit by phosphorescent moss growing in veins along the walls. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like blood left to dry. And Tim knew. He knew the corridor extended 40 feet before branching left and right. He knew the left branch led to a pit trap disguised as solid stone, while the right branch was safe but patrolled by 3 goblin-like creatures with jagged bone weapons. He knew there was a chest in the second chamber on the right path, wooden with iron bands, containing 16 silver coins and a crude health potion. He knew the boss chamber was at the end of the northern corridor, accessible through the main route or via a hidden passage behind a false wall in the 4th chamber. He knew the dungeon's name, whispered directly into his mind like a secret shared between old friends. Hollow Roots. Female. Terrified. Tim blinked, steadying himself against the sudden flood of information. Sarah G and Tony stepped through behind him, and the dungeon's presence receded slightly, no longer pressing against his awareness quite so insistently. "You all right?" Sarah G asked, watching him with mild concern. "Fine," Tim said. "Just adjusting." "First time's always a little overwhelming," she said sympathetically. "The air feels wrong, right? Like you're breathing something that isn't quite oxygen?" Tim nodded, though that wasn't what he'd felt at all. He looked down the corridor toward the branch he knew was coming. "This way," he said, starting forward. Sarah G and Tony exchanged glances and followed. When they reached the fork, Tim turned right without hesitation. "Wait," Tony said. "We should check the left branch. We've documented a trap there, but we haven't fully mapped the corridor beyond it." "It's a dead end," Tim said. "Just the pit trap and an empty chamber." Tony frowned. "How do you know that?" Tim paused, realizing his mistake. He couldn't tell them, he simply knew. That would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "Lucky guess," he said, forcing a casual shrug. "The right path looks more traveled." Tony's frown deepened, but he didn't argue. They continued down the right corridor, and Tim led them past the goblin patrol. He could sense their positions through the walls, 3 creatures huddled in an alcove 20 feet ahead, by taking a side passage that curved around the chamber entirely. "How did you know about this passage?" Sarah G asked as they emerged on the other side. "I didn't," Tim lied. "Just seemed like dungeons would have alternate routes." "Most don't," Tony said quietly. "Not on the first floor." They reached the second chamber, and Tim walked directly to the chest in the corner. Sarah G started to protest. "We should check for traps first," but Tim had already flipped the latch and opened it. No trap triggered. Inside were the 16 silver coins and the health potion, exactly as he'd known there would be. Sarah G stared. "You just opened it." "It wasn't trapped," Tim said. "You didn't check." "I could tell it wasn't trapped." "How?" Tim didn't have an answer for that. He picked up the potion, examined it briefly, and handed it to Sarah G. "Split the coins 3 ways." She took the potion mechanically, still staring at him. "Tim, have you really never been in a dungeon before?" "First time," he said honestly, "because you're moving like you've done this 100 times. Tim met her gaze. "I'm just paying attention." Tony stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Paying attention doesn't explain how you knew about the side passage, or how you knew the chest wasn't trapped. Or," he stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly, "are you using some kind of detection magic?" "I don't have magic," Tim said. "Then how are you doing this?" Tim hesitated. He could feel the dungeon around him, a living presence observing them with wary curiosity. Hollow Roots was young, newly formed, still learning what it meant to exist. She was afraid of adventurers, afraid of being broken, afraid of dying before she understood what life was. And she was watching Tim with something close to recognition. "I'm good at reading patterns," Tim said finally. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was reading patterns, just not in the way Tony assumed. Tony studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, lead on then. They continued deeper into the dungeon. The next two chambers passed in a blur. Tim navigated traps with impossible precision, stepping over pressure plates he shouldn't have been able to see, avoiding tripwires hidden in shadow, sidestepping a collapsing ceiling trigger that Sarah G. swore had been randomly placed. That one doesn't activate every time, she insisted. We've walked through this corridor 4 times, and it only collapsed twice. It activates when you step on the 3rd stone from the left, Tim said, pointing. See the crack? The pressure mechanism is underneath. Sarah G. crouched, examining the stone. I don't see any, she stopped. Wait, there's a crack. How did you? She looked up at him, her expression hovering between amazement and suspicion. Tim, what's going on? I'm just observant. Nobody's this observant. Before Tim could respond, a creature lunged from the shadows. It was one of the goblin things, waist-high, gray-skinned, with oversized eyes and a mouth full of needle teeth. It shrieked as it swung a crude blade made of sharpened bone. Tim moved without thinking. His hand dropped to his knife, drew it in a single smooth motion, and drove the blade into a specific point, just beneath the creature's sternum. The goblin's shriek cut off mid-sound. It convulsed once and collapsed, dead before it hit the ground. Tim stepped back, pulling his knife free and wiping it on the goblin's leather harness. The whole exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. Sarah G. and Tony stared at him. 1 hit, Sarah G. said faintly. You killed it in 1 hit. Tim looked down at the corpse. He'd struck the failure point, the exact anatomical location where dungeon-spawned monsters were most vulnerable. For this creature, it had been the cluster of magic-infused nerves that controlled its limbs. Sever that, and the monster died instantly, regardless of its resilience or healing factor. He'd known where to strike the same way he knew where the traps were. Lucky shot, he said. That wasn't luck, Tony said. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it now. That was training, military training, or something close to it. Tim sheathed his knife. I'm not military. Then where did you learn to fight like that? I didn't learn. I just reacted. Tony's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, not threateningly, but with the casual readiness of someone who had been taught never to be caught unprepared. Tim, I don't know what you're hiding, but you're not a novice adventurer. Nobody moves like you do without years of experience. I registered yesterday, Tim said. You can check the guild records. Registration proves nothing, Tony said. Only that you paid the fee. Sarah G. stepped between them, hands raised. Okay, let's everyone take a breath. Tony, he's helping us. He hasn't done anything wrong. She turned to him. I don't know what your deal is, but you're clearly way more skilled than you let on. Which is fine, people have secrets. But if we're going to keep running dungeons together, I need to know. Are you going to get us killed? Tim met her gaze. No. You sure? I'm sure. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good enough for me. She shot Tony a pointed look. We proceed, carefully. Tony's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and gestured for Tim to continue leading. They reached the boss chamber an hour later. The entrance was exactly where Tim had known it would be, a large iron-banded door at the end of the northern corridor, flanked by unlit torches. Sarah G. and Tony had stopped asking questions after the 3rd trap Tim avoided, and the 2nd monster he killed with a single strike. Now they just followed, watching him with expressions that oscillated between awe and unease. Tim stopped in front of the door and turned to face them. The boss is on the other side. How do you know? Sarah G. asked. Because this is a boss door. Look at the hinges, reinforced iron. The handle, shaped like a claw. Dungeons mark their boss chambers. It was true, as far as it went. But the real reason he knew was because Hollow Roots had told him. Not in words, exactly, but in the way the dungeon's presence intensified near this door, a mixture of pride and fear. Tony drew his sword. What kind of boss? Tim focused, extending his awareness toward the chamber beyond. The dungeon showed him willingly. A stone room, 30 feet across, with a creature in the center. Humanoid, 8 feet tall, covered in bark-like armor with roots growing from its shoulders like tendrils. A root worm. Slow but incredibly strong, capable of regenerating damage unless its core, a glowing seed embedded in its chest, was destroyed. Root Warden, Tim said. Big armored, regenerates. Kill the glowing core in its chest to put it down permanently. Sarah G's eyes widened. How do you know what the boss is? I don't know for certain, Tim lied. But root wardens are common in forest dungeons. It's a logical guess. Logical, Tony repeated flatly. Do you want to fight it or not? Tim asked. Tony held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. We fight. But after this, we're having a conversation about who you really are. Fine, Tim said, and pushed open the door. The root warden was exactly as he'd seen it in his mind. It stood in the center of the chamber, motionless until they entered, then turned toward them with grinding slowness. The seed in its chest pulsed with sickly green light. Roots writhed across the floor like serpents. Tim drew his knife. Sarah, left flank. Tony, right. I'll take center and draw its attention. You're not equipped for tanking, Tony said sharply. I won't need to tank, just trust me. Before they could argue, Tim stepped forward. The root warden lunged, impossibly fast for something so large, its root tendrils whipping toward him like spears. Tim sidestepped the first, ducked the second, and drove his knife into the third, severing it at the base. The creature howled, a sound like splintering wood, and swung a massive fist. Tim rolled under it, came up inside its guard, and plunged his knife into the glowing seed. The root warden froze. The light in its chest flickered, dimmed, and went out. The creature collapsed forward, and Tim stepped back as it crashed to the floor, disintegrating into ash and ambient mana. Silence filled the chamber. Sarah G lowered her sword slowly. What the fuck was that? Tim sheathed his knife. That was the boss. You killed it in 10 seconds. It had an obvious weak point. Nothing has a weak point that obvious. Tony approached the disintegrating corpse, his expression carefully neutral. Root wardens are notoriously difficult to kill. Even experienced adventurers take several minutes to bring one down. You did it in one strike. I got lucky, Tim said. No. Tony turned to face him, his sword still drawn but pointed at the ground. You didn't. You knew exactly where to strike. Just like you knew where the traps were. Just like you knew how to kill the goblins. Just like you knew where the boss chamber was. He paused. Tim Willett, I don't know what you are, but you are not a novice adventurer. Tim met his gaze without flinching. I'm exactly what I said I am. I registered yesterday. This is my first dungeon. Then how? I don't have an explanation you'll believe, Tim said quietly. But I'm not a threat to you or Sarah. I'm not going to get you killed, and I'm not going to lie to you about my intentions. I want to explore dungeons. I want to understand them. And I want companions I can trust. He glanced at Sarah G. If you don't want to party with me after this, I understand. But I meant what I said. I'm not here to hurt anyone. Sarah G and Tony exchanged a long look, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Sarah G sighed. I still have about 100 questions. That's fair, Tim said. But you saved our asses in there, and you didn't have to invite us to party with you in the first place. She sheathed her sword. So I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. For now. Tony didn't sheath his weapon immediately. He studied Tim with those sharp gray eyes, weighing something Tim couldn't quite read. Very well, Tony said at last. We'll continue as a party, but I will be watching you, Tim Willett. And if you endanger Sarah, intentionally or otherwise, we will have a very different conversation. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it was a threat nonetheless. Tim nodded. Understood. Tony sheathed his sword. The tension didn't quite leave the chamber, but it eased. Sarah G walked over to the pile of ash that had been the root warden and nudged it with her boot. A small object glinted in the remains. A seed, similar to the one that had been in the creature's chest, but dormant now. She picked it up. Boss loot, she said, turning it over in her hand. We can sell this at the guild. Should fetch at least 50 silver, maybe more. She glanced at Tim. Split 3 ways? Split 3 ways, Tim agreed. Sarah G grinned, some of her earlier humor returning. Well, if nothing else, Tim Willett, you're profitable to adventure with. Tony didn't smile, but his posture relaxed slightly. We should return to the surface and report the boss kill to the guild. They'll want to verify it and update the dungeon's ranking. They turned toward the exit, but as they did, Tim felt a faint pulse of emotion from the dungeon itself. Gratitude. Relief. He paused, glancing back at the chamber. Hollow Roots was still afraid, but the fear had lessened. She had shown him everything, and he had taken only what was necessary. He had killed her monsters, yes, but he had killed the boss cleanly, without cruelty, without lingering. She did not yet understand what he was, but she understood that he was not like the others. Tim followed Sarah G and Tony out of the dungeon, feeling the pull of hollow roots fade as they stepped through the archway and back into the forest clearing. The sun was lower now, afternoon giving way to early evening. Birds called from the trees. The world felt normal again. But Tim knew it wasn't. He had entered his first dungeon. He had revealed more than he'd intended. And now he had companions. Sarah G with her straightforward kindness, and Tony with his carefully hidden background and watchful eyes. This was only the beginning. And somewhere, deep in the earth, other dungeons were already whispering about the stranger who walked their halls and understood them in ways no one else could. Chapter 3. The Whispering Dark. The guild hall was busier in the evening than it had been that morning. Adventurers crowded around tables, celebrating successful runs or mourning failed ones over mugs of ale. The notice board had been picked nearly clean, only a handful of low-paying jobs still pinned to the wood. The three clerks behind the counter looked even more exhausted than before, processing paperwork with mechanical efficiency. Tim, Sarah G, and Tony joined the queue, waiting their turn. Sarah G held the boss core carefully in both hands, the dormant seed pulsing with faint residual magic. Tony carried the coins they'd split from the chest, while Tim had tucked the health potion into his belt. "First boss kill on your first run," Sarah G said, shaking her head. "That's got to be some kind of record." "Unlikely," Tony said, "but certainly unusual." "Unusual," Sarah G repeated, grinning at Tim. "That's Tony speak for impressive, but I'm too dignified to gush about it." Tony's expression didn't change, but there was the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I don't gush. You absolutely don't. It's very proper and mysterious." They reached the counter. The same clerk from that morning looked up, recognized Tim, and raised an eyebrow. "Back already? Either you died immediately and respawned, or you had a very short run." "Boss kill," Sarah G said, setting the core on the counter. "Hollow Roots Dungeon, first floor." The clerk's other eyebrow joined the first. She picked up the core, examined it closely, then set it on a brass scale. The scale glowed softly, measuring not just weight but magical density. "Root Warden core," the clerk confirmed. "First floor boss. Hollow Roots was only discovered 2 weeks ago, and you're the first party to report a successful boss kill." She made notes in a ledger. "I'll need your party registration." "We're not registered as a party yet," Sarah G admitted. "We just met this morning." The clerk sighed. "Then I'll need individual identifications and a party formation request. Names?" "Sarah Gellin, Sarah G on the rolls. Anthony." Tony paused for the briefest moment. "Tony, no surname." The clerk looked up, pen hovering over paper. "Adventurers are required to provide a surname for legal documentation." "I don't use one," Tony said, his tone polite but firm. The clerk frowned. "Guild regulations allow for exceptions in cases of personal or safety-related concerns," Tony said smoothly. "I invoke that exception." The clerk stared at him. Tim watched the exchange with quiet interest. The way Tony had cited the regulation, precise, practiced as though he'd memorized the entire guild handbook, spoke to someone accustomed to navigating bureaucracy. Someone who knew how to use rules to his advantage. The clerk made an annoyed sound but wrote Tony, no surname, in her ledger. "And you?" she asked, looking at Tim. "Tim Willett." She wrote it down. "Party name?" Sarah G and Tony looked at each other, then at Tim. "We haven't discussed that," Sarah G said. "Then discuss it now. I need something for the paperwork." They stepped aside to let the next adventurer approach while they huddled near the wall. "Suggestions?" Sarah G asked. "The Hollow Company," Tony offered. "After our first successful dungeon." "Too formal," Sarah G said. "What about the Root Breakers?" "Too literal." They both looked at Tim. He shrugged. "I'm fine with whatever you choose." "That's not helpful," Sarah G said, but she was smiling. "Okay, how about the 3 paths? Since we're 3 people finding our way," Tony considered. "Acceptable." "Wow, high praise," Sarah G said dryly, but she turned back to the clerk and called out, "The 3 paths." The clerk noted it without comment. "Registration fee is 2 silver per person. You'll receive a party charter that allows you to sign up for group contracts and share loot officially through the guild." They paid. The clerk stamped 3 metal plates identical to their individual identification tags, but marked with a small symbol, 3 lines converging at a point, and handed them over. "Congratulations," she said, her tone suggesting this was the 100th party she'd registered that week. "Now about the boss core." She consulted the scale reading. Standard buyout for a root warden core is 40 silver. However, since this is the first documented kill for Hollow Roots, there's a discovery bonus. Total comes to 65 silver. Sarah G's eyes widened. 65? Plus the 16 you retrieved from the chest, that's 81 silver total. The clerk counted out the coins and slid them across the counter. Split 3 ways, that's 27 each. Tim had never held 27 silver coins before. He wasn't even entirely sure what they could buy. But Sarah G was beaming, and even Tony looked quietly pleased. "Thank you," Sarah G said, scooping up her share. They left the guild hall as the sun touched the horizon, painting Kran's streets in shades of orange and gold. "I'm buying dinner," Sarah G announced. "And ale. Lots of ale." "You're celebrating," Tony observed. "Damn right I'm celebrating. Do you know how long it usually takes to make 27 silver? Weeks, if you're careful. Months, if you're unlucky." She clapped Tim on the shoulder. "And we did it in 1 day because our mysterious new friend happens to be a dungeon-walking savant." Tim didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They found a tavern called the Howling Wolf, claimed a corner table, and ordered food. The stew was thick and salty, the bread was warm, and the ale was stronger than Tim expected. He sipped it cautiously while Sarah G recounted the day's events to an increasingly drunk table of adventurers nearby, embellishing only slightly. Tony ate in silence, his gaze occasionally drifting to Tim with that same measuring expression. After the meal, Sarah G yawned and stretched. "I'm calling it a night. We should do another run tomorrow. Hollow Roots, or maybe scout a different dungeon." "Agreed," Tony said. "Rest is essential." They walked back to their respective lodgings. Sarah G and Tony shared a room at an inn called the Traveler's Rest, slightly nicer than the Split Coin. They bid Tim good night at the door, and he continued down the street alone. The pull hit him the moment he entered his room. It was different from Hollow Roots, sharper, more insistent, almost angry. It came from the west, beyond Cran's walls, perhaps an hour's walk into the hills. A dungeon, young like Hollow Roots, but this one was hostile. It called to him not with fear or curiosity, but with challenge and rage, and it knew his name. Not Tim Willett, the other name, the one that existed in the knowledge etched into his soul. Dungeon Lord. Tim sat on the edge of his bed, trying to ignore it. He needed sleep, needed to rest, to process the day, to figure out how much he could safely reveal to Sarah G and Tony without completely alienating them. But the pull wouldn't stop. It wrapped around his thoughts like thorns, dragging his attention westward again and again. He could hear it now, not with his ears but with something deeper. A voice like grinding stone and dripping water. "Come. Face me. Die like the rest." Tim lay down, closed his eyes, tried to sleep. The voice grew louder. "Coward. Pretender. You are nothing. Come." An hour passed. Then 2. Tim stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched, trying to will the pull away through sheer stubbornness. It didn't work. Finally, near midnight, he rose. He dressed quietly, strapped on his knife, and slipped out of the Split Coin without waking the innkeeper. The streets were empty. Cran slept. Tim walked west. The dungeon entrance was hidden in a shallow cave carved into a hillside, marked only by the same reality-warping symbols he'd seen at Hollow Roots. This archway was smaller, cruder, as though the dungeon had formed in haste or fury. Tim stopped at the threshold. The pull was strongest here, almost painful in its intensity. "You called," he said quietly. "I'm here." The air inside the cave shivered, and for the first time Tim felt something he hadn't felt with Hollow Roots: recognition. This dungeon knew what he was. He stepped through the archway. The first floor materialized around him, a rough-hewn tunnel system, walls slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of rot and rust. The dungeon's presence slammed into him like a physical blow, and Tim staggered, catching himself against the wall. The voice was immediate, louder than before, resonating through the stone itself. "Dungeon Lord." Tim straightened slowly. "You know what I am." "I know. The network knows. Hollow Roots whispered your return." "Then you know I don't kill dungeons that cooperate. I do not cooperate. I do not bend. I am marrow. I am male. I am death." The dungeon's name settled into Tim's mind. Marrow, male, 16 variant, Bowen Warrens. Marrow, Tim said aloud, testing the name. The walls trembled at the sound. You speak my name. You dare. I'm here because you wouldn't stop calling me. I called to show you truth. You are not lord here. You are prey. Tim felt the dungeon's layout bloom in his awareness. 20 chambers connected by narrow corridors, traps designed to maim rather than kill quickly, monsters bred for cruelty. The boss chamber held something twisted and wrong. A creature Marrow had shaped specifically to counter what he assumed Tim would do. This dungeon wanted him dead, not out of fear, out of pride. Tim walked deeper into the tunnel, his footsteps echoing. Tomorrow, he said clearly, I'm coming back, and I'm not just going to conquer you, Marrow, I'm going to end you. The entire dungeon shook. Stone groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling. The walls pulsed with rage and something else, something that might have been fear if Marrow had been willing to admit it. You cannot end me. I am eternal. I am? You're afraid, Tim said quietly. You know what I can do. You know I can see every trap, every monster, every failure point. You know that when I return, you'll die. That's why you're threatening me. That's why you called me here. You wanted to scare me off before I could come back prepared. Silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the dungeon, so deep it might have been the core itself, a voice like wind through broken bones. Dungeon Lord. You die tomorrow. The words echoed through the tunnels, carried on a current of cold air that smelled of old blood and older stone. They weren't just a threat, they were a promise. A declaration. Tim turned and walked back toward the entrance. He didn't respond. Didn't need to. Tomorrow would provide all the answer Marrow required. Behind him, the dungeon settled into watchful silence, its presence coiled like a spring. Tim emerged from the cave into cool night air. He took a breath, steadying himself, and started back toward Cran. He didn't notice the shadow that detached from a cluster of rocks 30 feet away. Tony had followed him. He'd woken an hour after they'd parted ways, some instinct pulling him from sleep. He'd risen quietly, careful not to disturb Sarah G in the other bed, and looked out the window just in time to see Tim walking through Cran's western gate. No one left town alone at midnight. Not unless they had a very good reason or a very bad secret. Tony had dressed quickly, armed himself, and followed. Tracking Tim through empty streets had been simple enough. Following him beyond the town walls had been more challenging. But Tony had been trained in fieldcraft, trained by people who expected him to move unseen through hostile territory. He'd kept his distance, used the terrain, and stayed downwind. He'd watched Tim enter the cave, watched him step through the impossible archway, and then Tony had done something incredibly foolish. He'd followed Tim into the dungeon. The moment he crossed the threshold, the wrongness hit him. The air was too thick, the walls too close, the darkness too absolute. But he pressed forward, creeping through the tunnel until he could see Tim's silhouette ahead. That's when Tim started speaking. Tony couldn't see who Tim was talking to. There was no one else in the tunnel, but Tim spoke as though addressing someone directly, someone he knew by name. Marrow, Tim had said, and the dungeon had responded. Tony had heard it, not clearly. The words were muffled, distorted like voices underwater, but he'd heard them. The walls had trembled. The air had vibrated with sound that wasn't quite sound. Dungeons didn't speak. Everyone knew that. Dungeons were locations, phenomena, puzzles made of stone and magic. They weren't alive. But this one had spoken. It had called Tim Dungeon Lord. Tony had pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding, as Tim delivered his threat, and the dungeon responded with its own promise of death. He'd stayed frozen, barely breathing, until Tim turned and walked back toward the entrance. Tony had retreated ahead of him, slipping out of the cave and concealing himself behind the rocks, watching as Tim emerged and walked back toward town. Only when Tim was out of sight did Tony move. He returned to Cran in a daze, his mind racing. He climbed back through the window of the inn, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at nothing. Sarah G stirred. Tony, you all right? He looked at her, steady, practical, trusting Sarah G, who had invited a stranger into their party because he'd seemed like a decent person who needed help. I need to tell you something, Tony said quietly. Sarah G sat up, rubbing her eyes. What time is it? Just past midnight. Listen, I followed Tim tonight. That woke her up. You what? He left the inn, alone, I thought it was suspicious, so I followed him. Tony kept his voice low, steady, the way he'd been taught to deliver reports. He went to a dungeon, west of town in the hills. He went inside. He went into a dungeon? Alone? At midnight? Sarah G's expression shifted from sleepy confusion to alarm. Is he suicidal? No, he went there to speak to it. Speak to what? The dungeon. Tony met her gaze. He spoke to it, Sarah, called it by name, and it answered him. Sarah G stared, and she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Tony, you were drinking, you probably fell asleep, and I was sober. I followed him, I heard it. Tony's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. The dungeon spoke. It called him Dungeon Lord. It told him he would die tomorrow, and Tim told the dungeon he was going to end it. Dungeons don't talk. Sarah G said firmly. That's impossible. I know what I heard. You heard wind, or echo, or your imagination. She shook her head. Tim is just a guy. A talented guy with some weird instincts, sure, but he's not some kind of dungeon whisperer or whatever you're suggesting. He knew everything about Hollow Roots, Tony said. Every trap, every monster, every chest. He killed the boss in one strike, and now he's having conversations with dungeons. So he's observant, so he's skilled. Sarah G's voice rose slightly. That doesn't mean he's talking to buildings. I know what I heard, Tony repeated. They stared at each other in the dim light of the inn-room. Finally, Sarah G sighed. Okay, let's say, hypothetically, you didn't imagine the whole thing. Let's say Tim really did go to a dungeon at midnight and have a very one-sided conversation with it. So what? He didn't hurt anyone. He came back. He's not a threat. Isn't he? Tony asked quietly. We don't know what he is, Sarah. We don't know where he came from or what he wants. He appeared out of nowhere with skills that make no sense, and now apparently he's visiting dungeons alone in the middle of the night to threaten them. To threaten an imaginary voice, you mean? I know what I heard. Sarah G groaned and flopped back onto her bed. Fine. You know what you heard. I believe that you believe you heard something. But I'm not ready to decide Tim is dangerous based on one weird midnight walk. People do weird things. He's probably just processing or coping with something. Let it go, Tony. And if I'm right, then we'll deal with it when he's ready to talk. She pulled the blanket over herself. Now let me sleep. We have another dungeon run tomorrow, and I need to be rested if I'm going to keep up with our apparently supernatural companion. Tony didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to Sarah G's breathing even out, and thought about the way the dungeon's voice had echoed through stone. Dungeon Lord. Whatever Tim Willett was, he was not what he claimed. And tomorrow, Tony would be watching very, very carefully. Tim returned to the split coin, climbed the stairs to his room, and lay down on the bed. The pull from Marrow had faded, replaced by a different kind of tension, the knowledge of what he would have to do tomorrow. He would return to the Bone Warrens. He would navigate Marrow's traps and kill Marrow's monsters. And at the end, he would destroy the core. Not because he wanted to, but because Marrow had made a choice. The dungeon had chosen pride over survival, had chosen to threaten, to challenge, to kill, and so it would die. Tim closed his eyes and finally slept. In his dreams, other dungeons whispered across the network, their voices distant and afraid. The Dungeon Lord walks. The first has returned. Hide, adapt, survive. But one voice, deeper and older than the rest, spoke with something that wasn't fear. It spoke with hunger. Chapter 4. The Bone Warrens. Morning came too quickly. Tim woke to pale sunlight filtering through the inn's single window and the distant sounds of Crahen stirring to life. Cartwheels on cobblestone, vendors calling out their wares, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer already at work. He dressed, strapped on his knife, and made his way downstairs. Sarah G and Tony were already waiting at a corner table in the inn's common room, 2 plates of bread and eggs sitting between them. Sarah looked bright and alert, her hair freshly braided. Tony looked like he hadn't slept at all. Morning, Sarah G said cheerfully as Tim sat down. We ordered you breakfast. Hope you like eggs. Thanks, Tim said, pulling the plate toward himself. Tony watched him over the rim of a mug of tea, his gray eyes sharp and assessing. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Sarah G cleared her throat. So, another run at Hollow Roots today? Or should we scout a different dungeon? Tim took a bite of bread, chewed slowly, and made his decision. He'd spent half the night rehearsing this lie. making sure it would hold up under scrutiny. Actually, he said, I have a suggestion. I couldn't sleep last night, so I went to the local library. Tony's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on his mug. The library? Sarah G. asked. At Crawhan has a small collection of records about dungeons in the area. The librarian was still up. Apparently they keep late hours for traveling scholars, and she let me in to read. Tim kept his tone casual, matter of fact. I talked with some of the night staff who work there, people who've been cataloging adventure reports. They told me about a dungeon west of here, in the hills. Tony set down his mug very carefully. West, he said quietly. About an hour's walk. Tim continued, watching Tony's reaction from the corner of his eye. It's called the Bone Warrens. 19 floors. It was discovered about 3 weeks ago, and several parties have attempted runs, but nobody's finished it yet. Most groups stop after the 5th or 6th floor. 19 floors, Sarah G. said, eyes widening. That's a major dungeon, way above our level. Not if we're careful, Tim said. I spent hours reading reports from the parties who've gone in. I think I've figured out the patterns. Trap placements, monster behavior, boss mechanics. If you trust me, I believe I can get us through all 19 floors and defeat the dungeon completely. Sarah G. stared at him. You want to complete a 19-floor dungeon, on our second run ever? It'll take 2 days, maybe 3. We'd need to gather supplies, food, water, rope, medical supplies. But there are safe rooms on floors 4, 9, and 14 where we can rest. And according to the reports, there are natural springs on floors 7 and 12, so we can refill water there. And food? Tony asked, his voice still quiet. Some of the dungeon monsters are edible, Tim said. There's a species called bone scuttlers, small crab-like creatures. They're not poisonous and they're easy to catch, but we have to kill them a specific way. He paused, as if recalling information from a book. You have to crush the central nerve cluster in the back of the shell. Otherwise, they dissolve back into ambient mana before you can harvest the meat. It was all true. He knew it was true because Marrow had shown him the dungeon's entire ecosystem laid bare in an instant of connection. But Sarah G. and Tony didn't need to know that. Sarah G. looked at Tony. I told you that you were drinking last night. Tony's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. What? Tim asked, glancing between them. Nothing, Sarah G. said quickly. Tony thought he saw you leave the inn last night. I told him he probably dreamed it after having too much ale with some guys from the market. She grinned. Turns out you were actually at the library being a huge nerd. I don't drink to excess, Tony said stiffly. You drink occasionally, Sarah G. countered, and occasionally people imagine things when they're half asleep. Tim met Tony's gaze. The unspoken message was clear. I know you followed me. I know what you saw, and I'm giving you a cover story. Take it or don't. Tony held his gaze for a long moment, then looked away. The Bone Warrens, he said. 19 floors, 2 to 3 days. That's a significant commitment. It is, Tim agreed. But the loot from a completed dungeon, especially one nobody's finished yet, would be substantial. We're talking hundreds of silver, maybe more, and the guild offers completion bonuses for first clears. Sarah G. drummed her fingers on the table, thinking, it's risky, really risky. If we get trapped down there, or if you're wrong about the patterns, then we retreat, Tim said. I'm not suggesting we commit to suicide, but I think we can do this. Sarah G. looked at Tony. What do you think? Tony was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was measured. The risk is significant, but Tim has demonstrated unusual competence in dungeon navigation. If he believes the intelligence he gathered is reliable, I'm willing to attempt it. With the caveat that we retreat immediately if conditions become untenable. So that's a yes, Sarah G. said. A cautious yes. Sarah G. turned to Tim. All right, we'll try it. But we're spending the morning gathering supplies, and I want to see those library records myself before we go in. The library's on the eastern side of town, Tim said. We can stop there before we leave. Good. Sarah G. stood, brushing crumbs from her shirt. Let's get moving. If we're going to be underground for 2 days, I want to be very prepared. They spent 3 hours gathering supplies. Rope, torches, medical supplies from an apothecary who charged outrageous prices and offered dubious advice. Dried meat and hard bread that would keep for days. Water skins, bedrolls, a small cookpot. Sarah G. insisted on visiting the library. The building was modest, a single-room structure with shelves lining the walls, and an elderly woman cataloging scrolls at a desk near the window. Tim introduced them, and the librarian, Mistress Calloway, confirmed that yes, a young man had indeed visited last night and spent several hours reading dungeon reports. Very thorough he was, she said, adjusting her spectacles. Asked excellent questions about monster behavior and trap mechanics. We don't get many adventurers interested in research. Sarah G. shot Tony a triumphant look. Tony said nothing. They reviewed the reports together. Everything Tim had described matched the documented encounters, trap placements, monster types, boss mechanics. Sarah G. took notes. Tony asked clarifying questions. Tim answered them all with perfect recall, because he wasn't recalling anything. He was simply describing what Marrow had shown him. By midday, they were ready. They left Crehen through the western gate, walking into the hills with packs on their backs and weapons at their sides. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. Wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. Sarah G. was unusually quiet. Tony walked with military precision, eyes scanning the terrain. Tim led them to the cave. The entrance to the Bone Warrens looked exactly as it had the night before. A crude archway carved into a hillside, surrounded by dead vegetation and marked with reality-warping symbols. Sarah G. stopped at the threshold, staring. It feels wrong. They all do, Tony said. No, this one's different. Hollow Roots felt curious. This one feels angry. Tim didn't comment. She was right, of course. Marrow was angry and afraid and determined to prove itself. They checked their equipment one last time, then stepped through. Floor 1. The tunnel materialized around them. Rough stone walls, slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of decay. Dim phosphorescent moss provided barely enough light to see by. Tim's awareness exploded outward. He saw the entire floor in an instant. 23 chambers connected by narrow corridors, 14 pressure plate traps, 9 spike traps, 3 pit traps, 11 monster spawn points, 4 treasure chests, 2 trapped, 2 safe, and the boss chamber at the northern terminus. Marrow's presence pressed against him immediately, furious and familiar. You returned. Fool. Tim ignored the voice and started walking. This way. Stay close. Sarah G. and Tony followed. The first trap was 10 feet ahead, a pressure plate that would trigger a rockfall. Tim stepped over it without breaking stride, pointing down. Trap. Step over the discolored stone. They did. Sarah G. crouched to examine it. How did you see that? The difference in color is almost invisible. The edges are slightly raised, Tim said, and the stone sounds hollow when you tap it. He hadn't tapped it, but they didn't need to know that. They continued deeper. The first monsters appeared in the third chamber, 3 bone scuttlers, exactly as Tim had described. They were the size of large dogs, with segmented shells made of yellowed bone and multiple clicking legs. They hissed when the party entered, mandibles clacking. There, Tim said, pointing to the creatures' backs. See the ridge along the central shell? That's where the nerve cluster is. Hit it hard enough, and they die instantly. Sarah G. drew her sword. You want us to aim for a specific point on a moving target? Or we can fight them normally. It'll just take longer. Tony moved first. He approached the nearest scuttler with measured steps, waited for it to lunge, and sidestepped. As it passed, he brought his sword down in a precise vertical strike, hitting the ridge dead center. The creature convulsed and collapsed, its body solidifying instead of dissolving. Efficient, Tony said, pulling his blade free. Sarah G. and Tim handled the other 2. Sarah needed 2 strikes to find the nerve cluster, but she managed it. Tim drove his knife into the ridge on his first attempt, feeling the familiar give as the monster's failure point ruptured. They harvested the meat, pale, surprisingly clean, stored in cloth wrapping. It would keep for a day or 2. You really did your research, Sarah G. said, looking at Tim with renewed respect. I wanted to be prepared. They moved through the floor methodically. Tim led them around traps, through safe passages, past monster patrols. He indicated which chests were safe, 2 wooden ones with minor coins, and which were trapped. One that would spray acid, one that would trigger a blade mechanism. Every time Sarah G. or Tony questioned how he knew something, he had an answer ready. The reports mentioned this. Adventurers documented that. It's a common dungeon pattern. The lies came easily. Too easily. Tony watched him constantly, saying little, but his eyes never stopped measuring. They reached the boss chamber in under 2 hours. Skullcrusher brute, Tim said, reading the presence beyond the door. 8 feet tall, made of fused bone, slow but strong. Vulnerable point is the jaw hinge. Break it, and the creature can't regenerate. How do you know it's a Skullcrusher specifically? Tony asked. The reports described it, Tim said. Multiple parties encountered it. The reports said it was difficult to kill. They didn't mention a vulnerable point. I extrapolated based on similar creatures in other dungeons. It was a weak lie and they both knew it. But Tony didn't push. They fought the boss. It was exactly as Tim had described, massive, brutal, relentless. But Tim directed them with absolute precision. Sarah drew its attention while Tony flanked. Tim darted in when the creature overextended, drove his knife into the jaw hinge, and twisted. Bone cracked. The brute roared, staggered, and collapsed. The fight took 4 minutes. Sarah G stood over the corpse, breathing hard. That was almost too easy. We worked together, Tim said, and we exploited its weakness. Yeah, the weakness you somehow knew about despite nobody documenting it. Tim met her gaze. I'm good at reading patterns. Sarah G shook her head, but she was smiling. If you say so, pattern boy. They descended to the second floor. Floor 2. Marrow's presence intensified. You progress. You learn nothing. The second floor was larger, 30 chambers, more traps, stronger monsters. But the pattern was the same. Tim saw everything, guided them through, kept them alive. He killed a bonehound with a single strike to its skull. He disarmed a tripwire trap before Sarah G even noticed it. He found a hidden chest containing a healing potion and 40 silver coins. This is insane, Sarah G muttered as they rested in a side chamber. We're moving through this dungeon like we've run it a dozen times. Tim is exceptionally skilled, Tony said quietly. Exceptionally? He's supernatural. Tony glanced at Tim. Perhaps. The second floor boss was a pair of skeletal warriors, armed with rusted swords. Tim identified their coordination pattern. They moved in tandem, covering each other's blind spots, and instructed the party to split them up. Once separated, they fell quickly. They descended to the third floor, floor 3. The air grew colder. The walls glistened with ice. Marrow's rage was palpable now, bleeding through the stone itself. You will not reach my core. You will die here. Is it just me, Sarah G said, shivering, or does this floor feel hostile? It's colder, Tony said, that's all. But Tim could feel it too, not the temperature, but the dungeon's fury. Marrow was adapting in real time, shifting trap positions by inches, altering patrol routes, trying desperately to surprise him. It didn't work. Tim's dungeon hacker ability saw through every adjustment the moment it was made. The third floor took longer. The monsters were faster, the traps more complex, but they pushed through, room by room, until they reached the boss chamber. This one was different. Tim paused at the door, feeling the presence beyond. 3 enemies instead of 1. And they were smart. Coordinated. Marrow had invested more into this fight, poured more intent, more desperate creativity. What is it? Sarah G asked. 3 bosses, Tim said. Bone weavers. They'll use ranged attacks and area denial. We need to focus fire on one at a time. They entered. The bone weavers were humanoid, skeletal, wreathed in ghostly light. They hurled shards of bone like javelins and created walls of calcified spikes to control the battlefield. The fight was chaotic, difficult, exhausting. But Tim called out weak points, directed positioning, and kept them coordinated. Sarah G took a spike to the shoulder but kept fighting. Tony's sword shattered one weaver's ribcage. Tim drove his knife into the final one's spine. They stood in the boss chamber afterward, breathing hard, covered in dust and minor wounds. 3 floors down, Sarah G said, slumping against the wall. 16 to go. We're making excellent progress, Tony said, though he looked tired. Tim looked toward the stairs descending to the 4th floor. He could feel Marrow's presence coiling tighter, deeper, more concentrated as they approached the core. And then he heard it. Not in his mind, not through the connection, but carried on the air itself, echoing through the dungeon like a scream from the depths. Die, Dungeon Lord! The walls shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Sarah G's head snapped toward the source of the sound, eyes wide. She turned slowly to look at Tony. Tony stared back at her, his expression very carefully blank. Did you? Sarah G's voice was barely a whisper. Did you hear that? Yes, Tony said quietly. Sarah G's gaze shifted to Tim. What the fuck was that? Tim stood very still. He could feel both of them watching him, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't sound insane. I don't know, he lied. But Sarah G's expression said she didn't believe him. Not anymore. And in the silence that followed, Marrow's fury settled over them like a shroud, waiting for them to descend deeper, waiting to kill them all. Chapter 4, Part 2, Secrets in the Dark. They descended, floor after floor, chamber after chamber. Tim led them deeper into Marrow's depths. The pattern remained consistent. Tim would pause at each new level, his eyes distant for a moment as though reading something invisible, then move forward with absolute certainty. He avoided traps Sarah G swore weren't there a second ago. He killed monsters with surgical precision. He found treasure in places that made no logical sense. And with every floor, Marrow's rage grew stronger. The dungeon didn't speak again, not out loud, but its presence was a constant weight, pressing down on them like a physical thing. The walls seemed to lean inward. The shadows moved when they shouldn't. The air tasted of old copper and older stone. Floor 4. A warren of narrow passages filled with blade traps that swung from the ceiling. Tim led them through in single file, calling out timing intervals with perfect accuracy. Floor 5. A chamber of bone pillars that concealed ambush points. Tim identified each one before the creatures could strike. Floor 6. The boss was a massive skeletal serpent that moved through the walls themselves. Tim called out its emergence points 3 seconds before it appeared, allowing them to position and strike before it could coil. Floor 7. They found the spring Tim had mentioned, a pool of clear water flowing from a crack in the stone. They refilled their water skins. Sarah G stared at the water, then at Tim. How did you know this would be here? She asked. The reports mentioned water sources on odd-numbered floors below 5, Tim said. The reports mentioned possibility of water, not exact locations. Tim didn't answer. He simply drank and moved on. Floor 8. More bone scuttlers. They harvested 3, cooked one over a small fire Tim built with practiced efficiency. The meat was surprisingly palatable, firm, slightly sweet, like crab. Floor 9. A safe room just as Tim had promised. 4 stone walls, a single entrance, no traps, no monsters. Designed as a rest point for adventurers foolish or brave enough to delve this deep. They stopped there briefly, tended wounds, ate dried bread, then continued. Floor 10. The architecture changed here. The rough-hewn tunnels gave way to worked stone, carved walls, fitted blocks, deliberate construction. The air grew colder still, and the phosphorescent moss dimmed to almost nothing, forcing them to rely on torches. The monsters were different too. Larger, smarter. Bone constructs with glowing eyes that tracked movement and coordinated attacks. They fought through 3 chambers before Sarah G called a halt. I need to stop, she said, leaning heavily against a wall. Tim looked at her properly for the first time in hours. Her face was pale beneath the grime and sweat. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage on her shoulder, where the bone weaver's spike had struck on the 3rd floor. She was favoring her left leg. You're injured, Tim said. I'm fine, Sarah G said through gritted teeth. Just need to rest. Tony moved to her side immediately, examining the shoulder wound with clinical efficiency. The bandage needs changing, the wound is inflamed. He looked around the chamber. We should make camp. It's been nearly 12 hours since we entered. Tim checked the mental map Marrow had shown him. This chamber was defensible. 1 entrance, high ceiling, no obvious trap mechanisms. Not a designated safe room, but close enough. All right, he said. We rest here. They set up camp with practiced efficiency. Bedrolls arranged in a triangle facing outward. Fire pit in the center, small, controlled, fed with scraps of wood Tim had collected from broken crates in previous chambers. Tony cleaned and rebandaged Sarah G's wound, while she hissed curses through clenched teeth. I'll take first watch, Sarah G said once Tony had finished. No, Tony said firmly. You're injured. You need to sleep. I can. You can barely stand, Tony interrupted, and for the first time since Tim had met him, genuine emotion crept into his voice. Worry, fear. You're pushing yourself too hard, and if we lose you because you were too stubborn to rest. He stopped, jaw tight. Sleep, Sarah, please. Sarah G stared at him, surprised by the crack in his usual composure. Finally, she nodded. Okay, fine, but wake me if anything happens. Tony looked at Tim. You'll take the final watch. I don't want Sarah worrying about things while she's injured. I don't want to lose her like this. The raw honesty in the statement caught Tim off guard. Tony, careful, controlled, always composed Tony, was showing his cards. He cared about Sarah G deeply. I'll take final watch, Tim agreed. Sarah G settled onto her bedroll with a grateful sigh. Within minutes, her breathing evened out into sleep. Tim lay down on his own bedroll, closed his eyes, and let exhaustion pull him under. Tony waited until Tim's breathing steadied, then rose quietly. He moved down the corridor, 20 feet from the camp, far enough that their voices wouldn't carry but close enough to intervene if something attacked. Sarah G joined him a moment later, limping slightly. I thought you were asleep, Tony whispered. I thought you believed I was actually that injured, Sarah G whispered back. The wound hurts, but I'm not dying. Tony's expression flickered. Guilt, relief, frustration. You should still rest. I will, after we talk. She leaned against the wall, keeping her voice low. That scream, on the 3rd floor, what the dungeon said. Dungeon Lord, Tony confirmed quietly. You heard it, I heard it. Which means I'm not crazy, and you weren't drunk. Sarah G rubbed her face with both hands. Tony, what the fuck is going on? Can dungeons actually talk? Are they alive? I don't know. Tony glanced back toward the camp, where Tim's silhouette was barely visible in the firelight. But the dungeon recognized him, knew what to call him. And he lied about it, Sarah G said. He said he didn't know what it was. But I saw his face when it happened. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He just accepted it. He's been lying since we met him, Tony said. The library story, the research, all of it. He moves through these dungeons like he can see them, like he knows them, like they know him, Sarah G finished. She was quiet for a moment. I think Tim is lying to us. Either he doesn't know the truth about what he is, or he does and he doesn't want us to know. I think he knows exactly what he is. Then why travel with us? Why not just come down here alone? I don't know, Tony admitted, but I intend to find out. Sarah G pushed off from the wall, preparing to return to camp when something caught her eye. A section of the stone wall, darker than the rest. She ran her fingers along it and felt a seam, a hidden panel. Tony, she whispered. He joined her. Together, they pried the panel open, revealing a small alcove. Inside was a wooden chest, plain and unadorned, covered in a thin layer of dust. Sarah G lifted it out carefully, checked for traps the way Tim had taught them, examining hinges, looking for tripwires, testing weight distribution, and found nothing. She opened it. Inside was a single item, a leather-bound journal, aged and worn, with no title on the cover. Sarah G carried it back to the firelight, Tony following. They sat far enough from Tim to avoid waking him, and Sarah G opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was old-fashioned, careful, written in fading ink. The Lost Secrets of the Dungeon Lord, being an account of truths unspoken and myths half-remembered, compiled by scholar Anselm Varro in the year of the Broken Gate. To those who find this, know that what follows is not legend, but fact. Sarah G's breath caught. She looked at Tony. He nodded. She began to read. The journal was dense, written in the style of an academic treatise, but tinged with something like fear. Scholar Varro had spent his life researching dungeons, compiling reports from adventurers, studying patterns. And somewhere in that research, he had stumbled upon a truth that terrified him. The Dungeon Lord was real. The entity known as the Dungeon Lord appears in recorded history without pattern or warning, Varro wrote. No consistent origin, no fixed identity, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes young, sometimes old, but always the same in one regard. They understand dungeons in ways no mortal should. Dungeons fear this being. I have spoken with adventurers who claim to have heard dungeons speak, a phenomenon I once dismissed as madness, but the accounts are too numerous, too consistent. Dungeons recognize the Dungeon Lord. They call out to it. They rage against it. They beg for mercy from it. And the Dungeon Lord is death incarnate to them. Sarah G read faster, her heart pounding. Through my research, I have learned that dungeons are not mere locations. They are entities, alive, aware, capable of thought and adaptation. And like all living things, they can be male or female. Male dungeons, approximately 15 documented variants, are aggressive, territorial, proud. They view adventurers as invaders and the Dungeon Lord as the ultimate threat. Female dungeons, approximately 30 variants, are more complex. They feel fear, sorrow, desire, They can choose cooperation over confrontation. They can plead. They can bargain. And the Dungeon Lord understands this. They speak to dungeons. They know which can be spared and which must be destroyed. Sarah G. stopped reading, processing. Dungeons were alive, male and female, aware. And Tim could communicate with them. She continued, but there exists a deeper terror. Beyond dungeons lie labyrinths, ancient, vast, incomprehensibly powerful structures that dwarf even the mightiest dungeon. These too are alive. These too can be male or female. Yet the Dungeon Lord shows no mercy to labyrinths. Unlike dungeons, which may be spared if they cooperate, every labyrinth the Dungeon Lord encounters is destroyed utterly. Without exception. Without hesitation. I do not know why this is, but I know that labyrinths fear the Dungeon Lord even more than dungeons do. For to them, the Dungeon Lord is not merely death. The Dungeon Lord is extinction. Sarah G's hands trembled. She turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank, as though Varro had stopped writing mid-research, either unable or unwilling to continue. She closed the book carefully and slipped it into her pack. Tony watched her in silence. "He's the Dungeon Lord," Sarah G whispered. "Tim, that's what he is." "It would explain everything," Tony said quietly. "His abilities, his knowledge, the way dungeons react to him. But he doesn't know, or he does, and he's not telling us." Sarah G looked toward the camp, where Tim slept peacefully. "Either way, we're traveling with something that dungeons consider death incarnate." "Should we leave?" Tony asked. Sarah G considered. Tim had saved their lives a dozen times today. He'd led them safely through 10 floors of a dungeon that should have killed them 3 times over. He'd shared loot, cooked food, watched their backs. "No," she said finally. "We stay, but we watch him, and if he becomes a threat, we'll handle it," Tony finished. They sat in silence for a while longer. Sarah G felt her eyes growing heavy despite herself. The adrenaline of discovery was fading, leaving only exhaustion. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "Wake me if anything happens." Tony nodded. "I will." Sarah G returned to her bedroll and lay down. Despite everything, the revelation, the fear, the questions, sleep claimed her almost immediately. Tony remained on watch, his eyes moving between the corridor entrance and Tim's sleeping form, his hand never far from his sword. Tim woke for his watch exactly when he'd intended to, some internal clock more reliable than any timepiece. He rose quietly, noting that both Sarah G and Tony were asleep, their breathing deep and even. He added wood to the fire, checked the corridor entrance for signs of monsters, and settled into watch position. The dungeon was quiet. Marrow's presence had receded somewhat, pulled deeper toward the core, as though conserving strength for the confrontation to come. Tim waited 20 minutes to ensure the others were truly asleep. Then he stood and walked deeper into the dungeon. He moved silently, knife in hand, following a pull he'd felt since they'd made camp. Marrow had hidden things on this floor. Treasures not meant for casual discovery, traps designed to kill the unwary. But Tim could see them all. He found the first chest in a side passage, concealed behind a false wall. The trap was elegant, a pressure mechanism that would flood the chamber with poisonous gas if triggered incorrectly. Tim disarmed it in 30 seconds, opened the chest, and found 70 silver coins and an enchanted dagger with a bone handle. He added them to the party's loot sack without comment. The second chest was more dangerous. It sat in a chamber filled with bone spikes, accessible only by navigating a specific path through pressure plates. One wrong step would trigger a cascade that would kill everyone on the floor. Tim walked through without hesitation, his dungeon hacker ability showing him the safe route. The chest contained a healing potion, a ring with minor protective enchantments, and 100 silver coins. He added those as well. By the time he returned to camp, he'd cleared 3 hidden caches and disarmed 5 lethal traps. The party's total loot had nearly doubled. Tony woke as Tim approached, hand on his sword, relaxing only when he recognized Tim's silhouette. "Where have you been?" Tony asked, his voice low but sharp. "Had to take a piss," Tim said casually. Tony studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but he simply nodded. "Wake Sarah. I'll get breakfast started." "I'll handle breakfast," Tim said. "You wake her. She trusts you more." Something flickered across Tony's face, surprise, perhaps, or suspicion that Tim knew more than he should. But he nodded and moved toward Sarah G's bedroll. Tim set about preparing a simple meal from their supplies. dried meat rehydrated in warm water, hard bread softened near the fire, a bone scuttler haunch they'd saved from yesterday, roasted until the shell cracked and the meat steamed. As he worked, he felt their eyes on him. Both of them, watching with new wariness. They knew something, or suspected something. Tim didn't mind. The truth would come out eventually. It always did. For now, he focused on breakfast, feeding the people who had chosen, however unknowingly, to travel with death incarnate into the darkness below.